Hi there, I'm Paul Rivera Jr. from Rivera Amplification, and this is Paul Rivera Sr., and we're here to talk to you about the brand new Rivera branded Stage IV amplifier.
Yeah.
Now tell me all about, what does Stage IV mean? Where did this come from? What is this amp all about?
Well, when I was developing a series of modifications in the 70s for various brands of amps, specifically Fender and Marshall, that we had developed a Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3, Stage 4, which various levels of modification. And that came about working with guitar players from the Wrecking Crew, such as Tommy Tedesco, Jay Graydon, Lee Rittenauer, and eventually Paul Jackson Jr., and so on. And we would develop these mods with feedback from the guitar players. Especially Jay Graydon was really instrumental in the early times, as was Dean Parks and Larry Carlton. And Jay would say, hey, man, can you make it sweeter? He had some Princetons that he wanted to modify, and Deluxes and Vibroluxes. So we would go back and forth making these modifications to make them happy. And eventually it became the de facto, you got to have a Rivera modified deluxe if you want to cut a track with this producer, because it was the producers heard it, liked it, printed the tracks with those tones, and then started requesting it. And so, of course, all the guitar players wanted to have the right tone. And so, you know, it just became like a necessary thing in your bag of tricks for a guitar player to have one of our modified amplifiers.
And that makes sense, all the LA session guys, because at that time you were working out of a music store called Valley Arts in Studio City.
Correct. Well, I actually started modifying the amplifiers in San Diego. I had a little company in San Diego called Libratronics. And then eventually I moved into Hollywood and set up my shop out of this guy's repair business called Red Roads Royal Amplifier Service in, I think it was 1623 North Cahuenga in Hollywood, which is now, I think, a dive bar, but that's another story. And so that's how I really got in contact with a lot of the studio musicians. And so once I started repairing and started to modify their amps, then it became, a large number of mods started there. And then eventually the guys at Valley Arts said, hey, we've heard about you. Why don't you come talk to us about setting up a shop? And then I set up a shop inside Valley Arts.
And so most of these mods were in the late 70s, early 80s?
Most of the mods were actually done between 1976 and 1980. I went to Fender in 1981. So that was probably 5 years, and I started consulting for Yamaha in 1976, working on a new generation of amplifiers for Yamaha. I was also consulting a little bit for Music Man and Big Nose.
It's interesting because when you moved on and started working for Fender, those modified amplifiers were still being used on thousands of recordings in here in LA.
And I was still actually doing the mods in the garage while I was working at Fender. So that kind of continued onward because people had a request for it.
And this amp is definitely known as the LA sound, because back then, like, for example, when you mentioned Jay Graydon, if you look at his website, right, and you look at his discography, it's organized A through Z, and every letter is massive amounts of recordings and artists. I mean, A, there's all this, B, there's all this.
I mean, you listen to his work on Al Jarreau, you listen to his work with Steely Dan, you listen to, his solo on Peg of Steely Dan is probably one of the most famous solos that there is, and that was used with one of the modified deluxe reverbs.
And he played on thousands of recordings back then, even when you moved on to Fender. And then Paul Jackson Jr. was definitely known for Diana Ross and Michael Jackson and so many artists as the ultimate R&B guy.
That's right.
And including the, what might have started this thing was Sweetwater asking us to modify their Fenders to get that same tone, because at that time we're working on Paul Jackson Jr.'s amplifier, his Stage 2 Fender?
Stage 2 Fender Deluxe, correct.
Now tell me the difference between Stage 2 and Stage 4. So this is a Stage 4.
So how it started was the Stage 1 was a 6-position switch, some additional gain stages, and so on. Stage 2 was master volumes with push-pull, boost controls, pull brights, and so on, along with a 6-position switch.
No channel switching?
No channel switching.
Okay, so when Sweetwater would send the Fenders for us to modify, that was a stage 2.
That's correct.
Right, and then this is the stage 4, which is now fully channel switching.
That's right. Yeah, fully channel switching. It's got the optical tremolo like the original Fenders, using an optical device, photocell with illumination. And it also has the tremolo is on both channels, and the reverb is on both channels, whereas the stage 2 reverb and tremolo were only on one channel, the channel that had the master volume.
So this is it. This is the top of the line.
This is the penultimate right here. And it has the active effects loops, which the stage 2s did not.
Now, going back to Paul Jackson Jr.'s amp, which was the stage 2, the actual amplifier that we recently rebuilt, was on some of the famous recordings with Dirty Diana. And
Michael Jackson, who's, and he also...
the beat it tone. I mean, the main riff, not the solos, Van Halen, but the main riff. And it was Paul Jackson Jr.
That's right.
And that exact tone from that exact amp, this is that tone. It's not, this sounds like it. No, this is the LA sound. This is the LA sound.
I mean, the way that we say it, basically, this thing has the Wrecking Crew tone bursting out from it. And it really does.
Really does. I coined this as your dad's tone. Your dad's tone, because it's from your dad's era, So
musical's timeless.
Music is timeless, but you grew up, this is your dad's records. It really is, So going back to the features of this, I see treble pull for bright, I see pull for notch on the second channel, I see the pull for gain. Tell me about the treble bright and the mid notch.
Well, the mid notch is about the frequency that's in between the treble and the bass control. And basically how it all began is really Leo Fender. When Leo Fender was building his first amplifiers, the Tweed series, there was a notch frequency between the treble and the bass was like 550 hertz. And Marshall, Ken Brand, who worked for Marshall at his music store, took a 5F6 Bassman and stuck some different output tubes in it, put it in its own chassis, and voila, the Marshall amp was born. But those frequencies were really started from the 5F6 Fender Bassman of 550 hertz. So then during the next era, which was the blackface era, surf tone was really cooking. So Fender actually changed the notch frequency because of what was going on in music. And he had a lot of players that he didn't play himself, but he had a lot of musicians that came into his environment. And so he changed the notch frequency and lowered it down to 250 to 300 hertz. So we have both with the notch switch, and let me tell you how it works. If you have a fat, like a Les Paul or a Gibson 335, it's got mid-range and bottom end, it just incredible amounts. And you need to actually remove some of it. You need to thin it out a little bit to be able to get some really sweet, clean rhythms. Conversely, you take a Stratocaster or a Telecaster that has single coils, and it needs fattening up. It needs bottom end because they're very skinny sounding guitars. If you ever play your Stratocaster through your home hi-fi, you'll know precisely what I'm talking about. So the two different frequencies use the 550 hertz frequency in the notch to fatten up the strings and add bottom end. You pull it out to get to the 250 to 300 hertz range to skinny it up. So you could go from Les Paul, which is, oh goodness, with great PAF pickups, sounds amazing, and you want to get it so it's really good for R&B rhythm. That's how you would use the notch. And we pioneered that. I mean, I pioneered the notch control in 1973. It was a long time ago.
So between the mid-notch and the fat switch, tell me about the fat switch and how they work together.
So the fat switch is a way of adding thick tones to the top end of the strings without adding bass. So you can fatten up your top strings, especially when you're distorting it. You're going into a lead tone and you want to get this really smooth, sweet overdrive. You're going to add this, and it's kind of like, I don't know, I almost want to say it's kind of almost like Cajun voodoo of adding those frequencies to the tone. And, And that was actually really the inception of that was because of Jay Graydon, because he wanted to add more fatness to his strings, and that's why we call it a fat switch, 6 position.
So between the 6 position and the mid notch, you have
yeah,
whole
and
plethora
the
of
treble
clean
bright
tones, right?
control and the presence, which is on the power amp. There's just a huge range of tones, and then you got to strat with a 5 position pickup selector switch. You've got 40 tones easy that you can get at your fingertips and on your guitar.
It's interesting because that is definitely the Rivera philosophy is, your clean tones are legendary and they do have a Fender background. However, it's just not such a narrow range. It's a much wider,
yes, that's right,
big picture is like what you like to say. So you bring this, however, this particular amplifier definitely has its own unique tone. I mean, it definitely is that era.
Well, we can talk about the fact that, channel 1 is a headroom channel. Headroom. You've got lots and lots of dynamic range on channel 1 because you're not worried about distorting it. Now, if you want to add hair to it, you can always overload the 6v6s on the output stage and add some hair onto it like you would with a tweed amp or a stomp.
Cranking it.
Yeah, cranking it up.
And that speaker won't fold.
And there's a magic that's going on between this speaker, and we should talk about this speaker. This is an Eminence that is dedicated to replicating the EVM 12L, which was the original speaker that we put in the Stage 2 and Stage 4 modded deluxes. Now, the reason that we used the Electro Voice originally was threefold. One is they didn't break, which means you could have thousands of hours of studio usage without burning the speaker out. 2 is it had a body of tone that was so interesting on the EV. Really, really, it's a little tricky because to really get that speaker moving, you have to really get some volume into it. If you turn the volume too low, it sounds cold. But once you actually get that voice coil and that cone moving, then it warms up and it fattens up. 3 is there is a magic that happens between the special output transformer that we have and that speaker due to the inductance and the whole idea of that motor structure inside that speaker. It's a large voice coil with a lot of copper in a giant magnet. And I think Eminence has done an admirable job of getting close to the original EVM 12L. And that's, the reason that we chose this speaker for this amplifier. It adds efficiency. There's at least 6 dB difference between the speaker and a Celestion, which means now you're playing through a 50-watt amp and not a 20-watt amp.
Oh, it absolutely has the headroom of a 70-watt amp. I was blown away.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a 20-watt amp.
But yet on the overdrive, it's not too powerful. You could get great gain, great lead tones, but you're not blowing the neighbors out.
I mean,
like 100-watt.
For example, on a JBL, which was a very clean-sounding speaker, I mean, we used it in our Sedona acoustic amp. You could not get the overdrive character that you can with this. It would probably, the JBL was better for a steel guitar or an acoustic guitar than it was for rock and roll. There were so many Mark I boogies that utilized the Electro Voice EVM 12L for the same reason. I mean, I remember, working on
Dumbles and all sorts of exactly. All sorts of manufacturers out there back then. The EV 12L was definitely legendary. Now, going back to the original tone, and let's say Paul Jackson Jr.'s amp only, because that was the most recent modified Fender that we had, at the shop. And, I was playing that Michael Jackson riff, the Beat It riff, right?
Yes, exactly.
And it was like, wow, that is actually the tone. It's undeniable. It's only
authentic.
this amp. Holy cow. And I can get it with this amp. But then I noticed this amp has more. You can go past that. It actually has even more gain. And now tell me, does the Stage 4 have more gain than the Stage 2? And
yes, it does. Yeah, because we were starting from scratch. We're starting with a preamp that has regulated DC for the filaments of the preamp tube so that we could get the gain without worrying about the hum noise. And it's less sensitive to a variety of tubes, and some AC filament amps like the original Fenders, some of the tubes that are available hum like hell right now.
Right.
And you don't experience that same issue. So then we could play with the gain and so on without worrying about getting the hum problem.
So you can get some of the more modern rock. I definitely wouldn't say that this is a heavy metal amplifier, but definitely a
Correct.
awesome, you know.
It's
Even Van Halen, you know, classic rock, high game rock,
classic rock, yeah. Even smooth jazz and other stuff, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of jazz cats that actually played this. And, you know, remember, it also was in Nashville. This became the de facto amp in Nashville.
That's right.
Because
Paul
of Chet Atkins.
Chet Atkins. That's
right. Jerry Reed, Paul Yandell. There was just a whole host of guys that brought that L.A. tone into Nashville. And as, you know, Chet was, you know, I'm just a huge Chet fan, an incredible person, and obviously an amazing player. And I remember one time he was playing with the Orange County Symphony or something, and he said, "Hey, Paul, could you bring me one of your amps, but make sure it has a cheap speaker in it, because I like the way they break up." And it was kind of funny to hear Chet, Mr. Fingerpicker, saying, "Could you bring me an amp with a cheap speaker?"
That's hilarious. So that particular amp probably didn't have the EV.
It didn't have the EV because he wanted to have a funky tone.
That makes sense. Wow.
Yeah.
So between Tommy Rotello, Tedesco, Jay Graydon, Paul Jackson Jr.,
Tim May,
Mitch Holder,
Lee Rittenauer,
Dennis Budimir. I mean, that was just the whole gamut of session guys back in the day playing these Rivera modded Fenders.
That's right. Yeah. Larry Carlton
As well. That's right.
Yeah.
Actually, I just got a call recently from Rick Beato explaining that he spoke with Larry Carlton's brother.
Yeah, Steve Carlton.
Steve went everywhere Larry went.
That's
and
right.
I know that past articles, I wouldn't always see Larry mention the Rivera modified Fender, just Fender, but Steve said, no, it was all Rivera modded Fenders back then.
That's right.
And that's why Rick was calling me of saying, what, tell me more about this amplifier. I didn't know anything about the Paul Rivera mods, but Steve kept talking about it. And it's
Steve
just interesting.
Steve was a great guy.
We're going to have to get Steve Carlton on this, on a Rivera podcast. So this amplifier, this video is taking place in November of 2020. And so by the time you're watching this, we probably already would have shipped some.
Yes.
And we're really happy to finally deliver this tone, to bring that tone. There's plenty of Riveras that can also get that tone, close to that tone, but this is the actual tone.
This is the actual tone.
This is the actual one. We've had many requests for many years.
Right.
You know, we were modifying Sweetwater's Fenders that they were sending to us, but this finally, okay, guys, it's time. And one of the things that this amplifier has, first for a Rivera branded product, is the tube rectifier as well. Now, tell me about the tube rectifier. What does it bring?
Well, the tube rectifier allows a compression in the power supply. The solid-state rectifiers have a stiffer supply, and the rectifier, because of its internal resistance and so on, actually adds a taste of compression onto the output stage, a little bit of sponginess. And by doing that, that stuff is really musical. It's kind of like, we can talk about also the optical tremolo. The idea of the optical tremolo is that the illumination turns on and turns off, not like a switch. And the photocell has its own ramp when it turns on, turns off, when it's zero resistance or high resistance. So between those two factors, that optical tremolo has this very musical, kind of swell to it when it turns on and off, and then coupled with a rectifier tube, which has that compression, power amp compression. I mean, the whole thing just is magic. Same thing with the 6V6s, our special output transformer, with that big motor assembly on that speaker. It all works together. It's like black magic, Cajun voodoo.
So sweet and spongy, but yet has all the headroom.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, playing this amplifier, I was shocked that it's putting out 25 watts, 27 watts?
Yeah, we rated it 25 watts, and,
it sounded like a 50-watt amplifier in terms of the headroom to me.
That's right. The efficiency of that speaker, 6 dB over a Celestion at least. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We'll get you there.
Yeah.
But it's a 112.
Right.
And tell me about some of the, compared to the modified Fenders of today that we were doing versus the Rivera branded products.
Well,
these are built here in Burbank, California.
That's right.
Using all military grade components, American made transformers, American made chassis, WEMA capacitors from Germany.
Yeah. In fact, these toggle switches are not imported. These are Arrowheart and Carling switches, and
Anywhere you can,
beefy.
anywhere we can, where
Yes.
we can recreate and actually have a production amp, because you can always get some obscure parts for the one-off.
That's right.
But how do you recreate that?
You know, like for instance, the filter capacitors we use are long life, high temperature caps. And as you know, we now have our tube rack series, the TBR series that were made in 1986 through 93. They're just now starting to show up to have some capacitors replaced.
Yeah,
so
far past 20 years.
Yeah,
far
so
past 20
we're,
years.
you know, that's why we chose those components.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you don't throw away an amplifier like this. You know,
No, this is an amplifier for life. That's right. You don't throw
keeper.
this. It's a keeper, right.
And especially because this is such a limited series, it really is a keeper in itself.
And that's the difference between, you know, some of the boutique amp companies like ourselves versus, you know, your
Mass
less
production.
expensive mass production. I mean, I wouldn't call those roadworthy for life amplifiers.
You can see the Chinese tube amps detonate after a certain amount of time, and
sure,
you know, they're built for cheap, not necessarily for quality and life.
And if they go, they're cheap enough. You just replace it.
Not to name names.
Yeah,
but there's one manufacturer who builds guitar amplifiers in China. There is no warranty service. They just throw it away and give you another one if it's within warranty.
Yeah, no, then it makes sense. Well, this amplifier is an amplifier. I mean, I personally play Rivera amplifiers at home, of course, and some of my amplifiers are more than 30 years old, and I love them. Is there anything more that we could tell our audience here about this amplifier?
Well, you know, like for instance, the chassis is a 16-gauge steel chassis that's made in Simi Valley using American steel.
I see 8 bolts. Talk about overbuilt.
Heavy duty.
Yes,
exactly.
Rivera's
this is
definitely
a solid
overbuilt.
wood cabinet with a plywood baffle board. There's no particle board in this.
Locally
amp.
made.
That's right. Exactly. We use a rugged grade of vinyl on it, a Tolex.
So this amplifier is going to bring you decades of enjoyment.
There's something hidden on this amplifier we can talk about. That's not obvious to see. It's got caster sockets.
Oh.
So you can plug in casters and roll it away.
Good, because this Eminence EV clone is not the lightest speaker.
That's
you
right.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
So with tone, you kind of pay for it with a little muscle.
Yes. The penultimate studio tone that was just so legendary, you know, with the whole Wrecking Crew, this amp oozes that Wrecking Crew tone. And it's built to last, and it's solid, and it's something that, you know, it may outlive you. And we're just
it's a must-have in your collection. It's a must-have. You want that actual tone. You
and
need
it's
this
a keeper.
actual amp.
That's right.
Unless you have an original modded Paul Rivera by Paul Rivera Fender.
Like for instance,
you're not going to find those. Nobody sells those, by the way. They keep them. You know,
Rick Nielsen is always afraid to bring the original Fender Deluxes that I modified for him in the 70s on the road with Cheap Trick. He keeps them in his house or a storage locker or something like that because he doesn't want to get them wrecked.
Oh, no. Actually, I think he actually does take them on the road. He's just trying to recreate that. So he's waiting for us to get those going.
That's right. Yes, that's right.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for covering this amplifier, and thank you so much for watching this video. And we're going to just continually releasing some demos and more on this amp as we go.
Get some players in here playing them, and
we should have Paul Jackson Jr. soon. We're looking forward to that.
So. Yeah.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you.